Hello, hello, wonderful to have you here. What I want to discuss in today's video are what are called the formless attainments in early Buddhism. These are some of the deepest forms of meditative absorption that we find in early Buddhist practice. So what are they? Well, to get that story out, it is a bit of a story. What I want to do is to begin a bit with the history of these attainments, to put them in their context, because I think if we don't know a bit of the history, the background, we won't really appreciate what these attainments meant to early Buddhism and what they really were. And then after having given that history, what I want to do is to go through the actual practice of the four meditative attainments, insofar as we find that practice reflected in the early texts. There isn't an enormous amount there, but there's enough at least to discuss in this video. So as the story comes down to us, when Gautama first left home in search of enlightenment, his first aim, his first goal there, was to learn practices of deep meditation. And he seems to have gone to a meditation teacher who we have to assume he believed was the best that he could find. This was a man named Āḷāra Kālāma. And Āḷāra Kālāma taught a form of meditation that was aimed at something called the dimension of nothingness. It was a form of formless attainment. That was how it came to be known. And having studied with Āḷāra Kālāma for a period of time, Gautama was able to perfect this practice, was able to get to that state so well, so proficiently, that Āḷāra Kālāma asked him to co-lead the Sangha with him. In other words, Āḷāra Kālāma would have had a large number of students, and since Gautama was so proficient, Āḷāra Kālāma asked Gautama to teach with him. However, Gautama says that he was not satisfied with this meditative attainment. He didn't believe that it actually led to the sort of liberation that Āḷāra Kālāma believed it did. So having become disillusioned with this form of meditation that had been taught to him, Gautama searched out a different teacher. Now, presumably while he was studying under Āḷāra Kālāma, he would have heard of a number of different meditation teachers, and presumably came to realize that one of them, a man named Uddaka Rāmaputta, taught a form of meditation that was even deeper than the dimension of nothingness that he had learned under Kālāma. Now, Uddaka Rāmaputta, so it is said, taught a form of meditation known as the dimension of neither perception nor non-perception. It's also said, and this is kind of an interesting thing, that Uddaka Rāmaputta couldn't actually achieve that state himself. Rāmaputta means son of Rama. In other words, that this man's father was a man named Rama. And it was said that presumably Rama could achieve this state. The father of the teacher could achieve the state, but the father wasn't around anymore. We assume he died. And so the son was trying to teach this form of meditation to students. Perhaps Gautama hadn't wanted to go to him originally because he was a guy who couldn't achieve something. However, Gautama was up against a wall here. He didn't know who else to study with, and this was a man who was at least teaching something that was supposedly deeper than what he'd already achieved. So he went to Uddaka Rāmaputta and started learning what Uddaka's father had taught. And indeed, Gautama was sufficiently proficient that he could actually achieve this state of neither perception nor non-perception. He was indeed sufficiently proficient that Uddaka Rāmaputta asked Gautama to teach in his place. So here he's even more advanced than he had been under Āḷāra Kālāma, where Kālāma had asked him to co-teach. Now Rāmaputta says basically, well, look, you can achieve a state that I can't, so why don't you teach? Gautama indeed could have taken over that Sangha and been a teacher, a meditation teacher, for the rest of his life, presumably. However, once again, Gautama was not satisfied with this form of meditation. He was disillusioned with it. He didn't believe that it led to the sort of liberation that Uddaka Rāmaputta believed it did. And so Gautama left Rāmaputta, and for all we know, these were Gautama the Buddha's only 2 meditation teachers in his entire life, so far as we know. They're the only 2 that are mentioned in the early texts, at any rate. Now, what were these forms of meditation that Gautama was learning? Now, of course, Buddhism as such didn't exist yet. Gautama had not become enlightened. Gautama was not teaching. At least he wasn't teaching anything that was unique to him. Now, there is some question about what these forms of meditation really were. The scholar Alex Wynn has written a book. It was actually his PhD dissertation that was turned into a book on the origins of Buddhist meditation. And Alex Wynn has a very provocative thesis, which I think is quite convincing, that these 2 teachers, both of them, were essentially teaching forms of Brahminic meditation. In other words, meditation in line with the Vedic Brahmin sort of school. However, they were forms of meditation that were very influenced by the early Upaniṣads. Now, the Upaniṣads were a series of texts, a couple of which were written before the Buddha's lifetime. More of them were written after his death, but in any event, the early ones were written before his lifetime, and they were ones that the Buddha himself was responding to in a number of his sermons. And so what Alex Wynn's thesis is, and I'll put it in his voice, he says that these teachers were aimed at achieving a non-dual state of meditation identical to the unmanifest state of Brahman. Now, that's rather a mouthful, but in the early Upanishads, there was this idea that liberation came as we understood the unity of our soul, our Atman, with this universal principle of Brahman. And this understanding, this unity of the self and the world, was something that happened to us in deep states of meditation. So, presumably, at least this is Alex Wynn's thesis, and he has a great deal of evidence behind it, presumably these states of looking to the dimension of nothingness or the dimension of neither perception nor non-perception are ways of sort of calming the mind down to a state at which we believe that we have become unified with the greater universal principle. These views of the early Upanishads would eventually turn into what is now Hinduism, Hindu views of the world, Hindu views of meditation. However, they were not the views that Gautama eventually decided to accept. He left them behind. And the reason he left them behind is he did not believe that they were liberating. In other words, Gautama was very proficient at achieving these states, but he did not believe that having achieved them, he had somehow demonstrated the unity of his soul with the universal principle of Brahman. Indeed, that whole picture is one that he would leave behind in his own, when he developed his own view, when he became enlightened several years later. So what happened then? Many years pass, and within Buddhist practice, within early Buddhist practice, we find a practice of achieving the 4 formless attainments, what are called the formless attainments. These are the attainment of infinite space. These are meditative attainments again. Meditation on infinite space, on infinite consciousness, the meditation on nothingness, and the meditation on neither perception nor non-perception. These are the 4. And you'll notice that the last 2 of these 4 are the 2 that Gautama learned from these first 2 teachers. The meditation on nothingness he learned from Āḷāra Kālāma. The meditation on neither perception nor non-perception he learned from Uddaka Rāmaputta. Now these are known as the formless attainments, for many reasons perhaps, but one of them, of course, is that, as we will notice, there's no visual perception, sort of internal visual perception of forms. Forms in Buddhism can mean something that we see. In other words, external forms are objects that are visible to us. They can also be understood as physical objects, so the forms are the physical objects of the world. we don't, when we're doing these meditations, we don't visualize any objects in them. So that's one reason to think of them as formless attainments. However, I think perhaps the more apt comparison would be with the jhanas, which I've done videos on recently. I'll leave links. I'll link to the videos on the jhanas down below in case you haven't seen those. But in the jhanas, there are similes given to each of the jhanas. There are certain controversies with similes that I won't get into. But the similes, at least if we take them at face value in the Pali tradition, imply that each of these jhanas is felt in the body. It has a bodily component to it. And the body in Buddhism is known as form, is the form aggregate, the aggregate of form. It's the part of our constructed self that is physical. Each of the four jhanas has a bodily component, a way that it's felt in the body. However, these other four attainments, the formless attainments, do not have any kind of bodily aspect to them. They are, to that extent, somewhat more ethereal, somewhat more abstract, if you like, somewhat more mental in their practice, I would say. Perhaps we could say that they're deeper or more absorbed. As we'll discuss presently, generally the practice of these four formless attainments in the early tradition is seen as following upon the practice of the four jhanas. So theoretically, the jhanas get us to a deep state of meditation, and then the formless attainments get us even deeper. So what is the practice then of the four formless attainments? The first of these, as I say, is the attainment, the meditation on the dimension of infinite space. Well, how is this discussed? How is this attainment discussed in the early texts? What it says is, a mendicant going totally beyond perceptions of form, with the ending of perceptions of impingement, not focusing on perceptions of diversity, aware that space is infinite, enters and remains in the dimension of infinite space. So this is, as we see, a pretty thin instruction on how to achieve this first state. It's especially thin considering how deep this meditation really has to be. But the general idea is that ordinarily in our conception of space, we think of space as occupied by objects, physical things. That is to say, physical objects, forms, as they are called, impinge upon our space. So we think of ourselves as being surrounded by tables and chairs and trees and rocks and the planet Earth beneath us and so on. However, the point here is that when we do this meditation, we should leave behind these ideas of objects impinging upon space, this diversity of things, and focus simply on the infinitude of the space itself. In other words, it's a space that's unoccupied by anything. It is, to that extent, unified, right? It's not, in other words, when we think of the space around us as occupied by diverse objects, we think of the space as diverse. It's split up into bits here and there that are occupied. Whereas we want to leave that behind and simply think of the space itself. But now the question that I'm sure you may have is, how do we get to this meditative attainment? In other words, okay, now we've defined the attainment, we understand the kind of thing that it involves, but how do we get ourselves there, especially considering how deep this meditative attainment is supposed to be? There's some controversy about this. There's some discussion. There's not a whole lot of unity of opinion about how we really get there. Given that Āḷāra Kālāma and Uddaka Rāmaputta taught the latter two of these meditative attainments, the latter two of these formless attainments, presumably they also taught the first two. In other words, presumably Gautama was taught this one, then he would be taught the next, and then he would have been taught the third by Āḷāra Kālāma, and then he would have been taught all three and the fourth by Uddaka Rāmaputta. That's what we presume. But once again, the question is, Did these meditation teachers simply sit him down and say, let's try to enter this state of infinite space? Or, for example, did they perhaps teach him the jhanas first, and then this meditation on infinite space? This is a question that is of some controversy. One possible answer is that indeed they did, that they taught him the jhanas first. That is, that the jhana practice was a pre-Buddhist practice, and that Gautama had been taught the jhanas as well by these teachers. And then, once they got to the fourth jhana, then they said basically deepen it and change the focus of your meditation to infinite space, and you'll get there. That's one possibility. And indeed, it's the progress that we find most often in the suttas. So if you look at the early suttas, they will have indeed precisely that progression, the progression from the four jhanas into the four immaterial or formless attainments. However, there is another option that a number of meditation teachers have pointed to, which wouldn't involve the jhanas at all, and which at least opens up the possibility that the Buddha was not taught the jhanas himself, that he in fact came up with them. Or at least he came up with some form of the jhanic meditations himself. One possibility would be that the Buddha entered, or the teachers would have taught Gautama to enter this meditation on infinite space through what's called the space kasina. Now, the kasinas are a number of objects that were constructed as meditation aids. In general, they were sort of circular objects with, let's say, a color on them, or with earth on them in order to represent earth, so that would help us to enter a kind of meditation on earth. The space kasina, however, at least as defined in the Visuddhimagga, which is a text, a 5th century of the Common Era text by Buddhaghosa, he defines the space kasina as a gap such as a hole in the wall, or in a keyhole, or a window opening. In other words, we use a gap in some sort of a wall or object to draw our minds towards the idea of negative space, if you like, of empty space, and then use that to enter into a meditation on space. And through that kind of meditation, perhaps Gautama or these teachers would have gotten him to just expand that consciousness of this negative space into all of space. This is just a speculation. Now, there are issues about the kasinas. I won't get into them here. It's possible that the whole idea of the kasinas as practiced this way is not early Buddhist. As I've said, this text that I get this description out of is 1,000 years after the Buddha's lifetime, 5th century of the Common Era. So it's hard to know for sure. The kasinas are mentioned in the early texts. However, they're mentioned in ways that it's not entirely clear that what we're talking about as meditation objects. We may simply be talking about styles of meditation, sort of meditation practices. It's not clear. There's a lot of unclarity in certain aspects of early Buddhist meditation practice, and the kasinas is one of them. Anyhow, back to the formless attainments themselves. We'll assume we've gotten to that first attainment somehow in one of these various methodologies, or maybe some methodology that's lost to us. Then we get to the second attainment. And how is the second formless attainment described in the early texts? Well, it says, a mendicant going totally beyond the dimension of infinite space, aware that consciousness is infinite, enters and remains in the dimension of infinite consciousness. Once again, this is a very thin description, but the idea here is that once we're in this very calm and deep meditation on infinite space, then we make a decision to turn the focus of our awareness, the focus of our consciousness, to the consciousness itself. In other words, we're aware, we're conscious of this infinite space in the meditation. Well, if we're conscious of this infinite space, then that consciousness itself must be infinite. In other words, it must go on without end in order to be able to encompass this apparent infinity of space. So we turn our attention, our awareness to the consciousness itself, and that's how we enter this second formless attainment. And I think you can see that we're getting very, very refined here in the direction and content of our awareness. These are not sort of ordinary awarenesses here. We're already getting to very liminal sort of states, very sort of strange and unusual states of awareness. And it's from that second formless attainment that we move to the third. This is the contemplation of nothingness. Now, this is the contemplation that Āḷāra Kālāma himself believed was liberative. In other words, that this attainment would free us from our bonds to samsara, that it would make us aware of the union or identity of ourself with this unmanifest universal principle. Unmanifest means that it's not manifesting as objects around us that we can identify. It's simply the state itself. So, okay, so how do we define then this third formless attainment? Well, in the early text it says, a mendicant going totally beyond the dimension of infinite consciousness, aware that there is nothing at all, enters and remains in the dimension of nothingness. So once again, this description is very, very thin. What we're told here is that we're to be aware that there is nothing at all. Well, what does that mean? One way to interpret that, one way that I've heard it described, is that when we're in this contemplation of infinite consciousness, we turn our mind to the unobstructed nature of that consciousness, that there's nothing at all that obstructs consciousness, right? Because if anything did obstruct it, we would be conscious of that thing. So the idea is that our consciousness pervades everything of which we're aware. It is without blockage. That can be one way that we would interpret this, that we turn the mind again to an even subtler stage here, an even subtler state of awareness, the awareness of the non-blocked state of consciousness, if you like, that there's nothing outside of it. That would imply, of course, that if there's nothing outside of it, that this is universal, right? That's another way of saying not just that it's infinite, but that it's universal, which we might think, be one way to understand this kind of manifest Brahman, unmanifest Brahman, this unmanifest universal principle. Another way that it's said to be interpreted is in the Visuddhimagga, again, this 5th century text, which describes these states in some detail, which suggests that we reflect back on the consciousness of infinite space, which is a consciousness that we've left behind, right? Because we're in the infinite consciousness right now, we're trying to move ahead to this further one. So we reflect back on the fact that there was a consciousness before, an awareness before, which no longer exists. And that's another way of gaining this further meditative attainment through the awareness that nothing exists, or that something does not exist, that this awareness of non-existence. Once again, these are very, very subtle states of consciousness, very subtle states of awareness, which is why they take such a long time to really achieve in meditation, why they are such advanced states. Now, I should say parenthetically that this meditation on nothingness is not the same as the meditation on emptiness, or what's called shunyata, which is another meditation that we find in early Buddhism. One way I've heard this comparison, I believe it was by Bhikkhu Bodhi, is to say that the meditation on emptiness is really more of a wisdom meditation or an insight meditation, whereas this meditation on nothingness is more phenomenological. That is to say, it's more about the appearance of nothingness to our awareness, to our consciousness. So these are very different. Now, I did an earlier video on the practice of emptiness meditation. I'll leave a link to that video down below so you can see the difference here. They're really quite different. Now we turn from this dimension of nothingness to the fourth of these meditative attainments, these formless attainments, which is known as the attainment of neither perception nor non-perception. Now, how is this strange state defined in the early texts? Well, what it says is, a mendicant going totally beyond the dimension of nothingness enters and remains in the dimension of neither perception nor non-perception. Well, I think you can see that this description here is really not hugely helpful. Now, to repeat what I said before, we should keep in mind this is the meditative attainment that was championed by Uddaka Rāmaputta. This was an attainment that he himself could not reach, but that his father could. It is an extremely subtle form of meditation. It's right in that liminal stage between perception and non-perception. We might say that, look, in that meditative attainment on nothingness, it was a perception of nothingness, or at least it was a meditation upon nothingness, which means there was some perception involved, because if we can name it as nothingness and be aware of it as nothingness, then there's some perception there. Whereas here, we're in a stage where we're sort of in between being able to perceive and not being able to perceive. But the question then is, how do we get there? And once again, this is really not described. Since the state is so liminal, there's really not much to describe in it. In fact, because any description would necessarily involve some form of perception, at least in the early Buddhist understanding of what perception is. As I understand it, the way that we get there is we're in the prior state of this meditation on nothingness, and what we do is to turn our mind to the perception of that nothingness itself. What is the perception of nothingness like? When we do that, we get ourselves to a state that, at least as it's described in the Visuddhimagga, which is perhaps the most extensive description of this that I know of in the early, well, not early, but in at least the Theravada tradition, and I don't believe there's a whole lot said about this in the Mahayana tradition, but that's a different question. It says that when we turn our mind to that perception of nothingness, we get ourselves to a state that minimally fulfills the description of a perception. In other words, we're perceiving the perception, but it's one without any real perceptual content. There's nothing really there to perceive. So it's this sort of in-between liminal state that we're in. I should say, if you know of other descriptions of these states and how to achieve them in the Mahayana tradition and earlier Mahayana traditions, let me know. I mean, I know there are indeed meditation teachers nowadays who will talk about them, but my interest is more in sort of earlier descriptions. The Visuddhimagga itself, written by Buddhaghosa in the 5th century of the Common Era, gives a couple of similes. One of them has to do with a bowl with oil in it. So we can think of a bowl and we might say there's oil in the bowl in the sense that there's a coating of oil, there's a little bit, it's dirty, the bowl is dirty, so we wouldn't want to put soup in it. We'd want to clean it first. On the other hand, we would say that there's no oil in the bowl if what we need to do is to fill up a beaker of oil. If someone says, can you fill up a beaker of oil with what's in that bowl? You would say there's no oil in this bowl because there isn't enough to do anything with. Another simile that he gives is that there's water on the road. Well, there's water on the road in the sense that you don't want to wear your sandals because they'll get wet. But on the other hand, there isn't water on the road in the sense that you can't bathe in it. You can't really do anything useful with it. So in these two similes, we can see that we're sort of in liminal states, in states in between. In the simile with oil in the bowl, there sort of isn't oil in that bowl. I mean, there is oil in the bowl, yes, but there isn't oil in any useful sense. Same with water on the road. These are two similes that Buddhaghosa gives in the 5th century of the Common Era that highlight or illustrate that kind of in-between state that we're in this fourth and final of the meditative attainments on the formless attainments. And these are 4 of the deepest meditative attainments we know of in early Buddhism, and it is indeed interesting to know that they come from essentially non-Buddhist roots, back in perhaps the Upaniṣads, or at least Upanishadic teachers. Now there is a deeper state of meditation as well, which probably, I think, literally can be considered a formless attainment, but is usually not included among the 4. Perhaps because it was not one of these states taught by these meditation teachers. But in any event, it is an even deeper state, and I'll look at it in the next video. And when that video is ready, I will put a link to it up on the screen. And meanwhile, if you're getting something out of these videos of mine, please consider taking a look over at my Patreon page and seeing if you want to help support the channel and the work that we're doing here. Thanks so much, and we'll catch you on the next video. And meanwhile, all of you, be well.